If you've ever built an Attio workflow and it didn't trigger or triggered more times than you expected, or maybe you're completely new to Attio workflows, this video is for you. I'm going to break down how Attio workflows actually work. Let's get started. Okay, so I'm in workflows in Attio, and workflows in Attio essentially listen for an event, a change, or an update to happen for it to run. So it's listening for something, maybe you created a new record, maybe you've updated a record, or maybe you've updated an attribute. For example, those are all triggers that you can use in a workflow so that the workflow automatically runs without your input. Now, I'm going to walk you through the different triggers so that you can understand what each means, and you will see that there are some slight exceptions to that rule, and that's kind of the beauty with Attio's workflows as well, is that there's so much flexibility. The first one is a little bit of an exception to that. So when you're on that record, let's say you decide you want to enroll this person in a workflow, you can click on the button, add to workflow, select the workflow that you want to enroll them in, and then the rest of the workflow will be auto run, of course. But that trigger is a little bit manual in the sense that you do need to click on that button. But it's nice for those use cases where you don't actually need the workflow to be auto triggered, and you want to decide on a case-by-case basis whether you want to add a record to a workflow. Okay, so now on to record created and record updated. So record created, if this is your trigger, then that means the workflow will fire on any new record created in Attio. And then you, of course, need to select the object. So what type of record would this be? Now, if you select the people object, you do need to be careful, because if you don't input any filters or conditions afterwards, that means this workflow will trigger on any new person created. And depending on how your email settings are set up, you could have person records being auto-created based on your emails, and so you do need to keep that in mind. But most of the time, when I'm setting up a workflow, it is for specific records, so we always input some sort of filter or condition on the next block to make sure it doesn't run on every single record created. On the off chance that you do want this to trigger on any new record created, then you can just leave as is, you select the object, and then the next block would be like an action block. And then record updated. So record updated, pretty self-explanatory. It means, if any record is updated in any way, then this workflow will trigger. Now, again, you can add in a condition or a filter block afterwards to put up guardrails and prevent the workflow from triggering on any new record or on any record that's updated. Now, there is a little bit of overlap here, right, with this attribute updated trigger. So this works extremely well for lists and record attributes being updated. The difference is you can pretty much set this up very similarly. You could have record updated. Let me just show you. Record updated people. And then it gives you the option to select an attribute. So if you want the workflow to only trigger on a record being updated on a specific attribute, then you can select the attribute here and then put in some additional conditions afterwards, and that would function the same. Now, the difference, right, with this attribute updated is that it's a little more precise, so the workflow doesn't start when a record is updated. With the record is updated trigger, it looks to see, okay, record was updated. Let's look to see if we should do anything with this. Then it looks to see, is there a filter or condition in place? Okay, there is. Does it meet or not meet the criteria? If it does meet the criteria, then it continues the workflow. The attribute updated block is a bit more precise. So you're looking at just an attribute. Like that's your trigger. So it starts when an attribute is updated versus when a record is updated. But they can be set up very similarly. And there's no right or wrong unless you want it to trigger on, a record or a list entry attribute. So with the attribute updated block, you can select either an object or a list and trigger it that way. Hopefully that makes sense. I know that it can sound a little bit confusing, but just think of it as this is very precise. This is not as precise, but you can make it precise with the right filters and conditions. List entry command. So this works very similarly to record command. So if you don't necessarily want to auto trigger the workflow and you want to decide on a case-by-case basis if you want the entry to be added to a workflow, then you could just select list entry command. And then if you're on a list record or list entry, I should say, and you decide, actually, I do want to add this list entry or enroll this list entry into a workflow, that's where that button would come in. You would see that button, add to workflow, and select the workflow. And then list entry updated. So, very similar to record updated, but list entry means any entries within a list. So if a list entry is updated, then this is when the workflow would trigger. So you'd have to select a list here, and then you can select an attribute if you are looking for an attribute change. Record added to list. So that's a trigger, right? You could either manually add records to lists, or you can have you could do it in bulk, or you can do it one by one, or you can have another workflow where you auto add a record to a list if it meets certain criteria, and then maybe you want a secondary workflow where if a record is added to the sales list, then these are the steps that we want to take. Attribute updated, I already touched on that. Task created. So if a task is created, then you can trigger a workflow based on that. For example, one workflow that you might want to create in this case would be, let's say you use Slack with your team and a task is created and you want to notify the team like, hey, here's a task for XYZ, and this is what we need to do. So you can have task created as trigger, and then the next block, it could also be, next block, I could do some sort of filter, or I could just go to, Slack, post message to channel, just to make sure that the person that's assigned the task can actually see the task, just in case they're not regularly checking their tasks, which in an ideal world they are. And then manually run. So trigger a workflow when it is manually invoked by a user. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory as well. You could manually enroll records into a workflow. And I can show you the difference between manually running a workflow and then the record command trigger as well. Reoccurring schedule. So this is one of those that's a little bit different than the typical event or change to trigger a workflow. So in this case, you would be triggering this workflow on a reoccurring schedule. So this is really helpful for internal tasks, I would say, or, maybe you want to check something on a regular basis. Maybe you want to follow up with someone every Monday at, 9 a.m. This would be a good use case for that. And you can select the frequency. Your options are daily, weekly, monthly. And then you can select the time and your time zone, and then that way the workflow triggers. So a very common use case for this one would just be, or a very common setup, I should say, would be, reoccurring schedule, this block here, and then the next block would be task created, for example, or maybe a message to a Slack channel. And then webhook received. So I'm not going to get too much into this one, but a workflow would be triggered when a webhook is received. So if you have another tool that you're connecting with Attio via webhooks, and this would be the trigger that you might be able to use for a webhook. And then I have Typeform integrated here, so form submitted can also trigger a workflow. So you might have some additional potential triggers here depending on the apps that you have integrated with Attio. Okay, so I do want to show you the differences between a record command and a manually run workflow. So this one here, test1.2 workflow, has a record command that would trigger on a person, and then the next step would just be creating a task. So I'm just gonna go to people and then run workflow, and then select the workflow that I want to run. And that's basically it. And then a task has been created, as you can see here. So that's a record command trigger. And you can also do that for a list entry. Now, if I do a manually run workflow, if I select manually run, then I can only really trigger the workflow from this workflow. So let's say I do manually run, but on what do I want to trigger this workflow? So, is it simply just a task that's not associated with any record? Then I would just select a block, and it would be create task. But if I want this to manually run for specific records, then I would need to select another kind of block. So find records or find list entries. So again, if this workflow is supposed to be associated with a record, then I do need to add in a find record block. And then when I'm in this workflow, then I can trigger the workflow here. I'm just going to simply set this up just so you can see. Okay, create task. Now, you'd probably want to add in some conditions here to find the right records, so on and so forth, matching people, linked records, for example, etc., etc. I don't really need to finish that because I just want to show you. Oh, I do need to actually input a condition. I forgot about that. So let's do, owner contains Kayla. Okay, so let's see. Because it makes sense, right? This block doesn't want to look for all people records that you might have in Attio. It needs some sort of condition. And so here you see this trigger manual workflow. So in most cases, I would say this type of workflow would work well for like testing or for situations where you don't necessarily need it to be associated with a record. So it's like an internal thing, maybe an internal task or a message to Slack, something along those lines. But most of the time, if you do still want this workflow to be manually triggered, record command or list entry command would work very well. Okay, so now I have this record updated trigger just as an example, and now I want to show you the next few blocks and what your options are. I am only going to go through the key ones. I'm not going to go into the more complicated or advanced blocks, because if you are newer to Attio workflows, I wouldn't suggest using some of the more advanced ones unless you are really familiar with what they do. So based on regardless of the trigger that you have, you'll have these options. So this is just an example. You don't really have to worry about my trigger. The next steps after you have a trigger, whatever that is, would be, create or update a record. So if you want to create a new record or update an existing record, for example, if there is no scenario in which you would be updating a record and you want to create a record, for example, Maybe your trigger is the company lifecycle stage or the person lifecycle stage changed to active opportunity, and now you want to create a deal from that person or that company record. This would be a great use case for that. Create record. Find records. Maybe you want to find records that match a certain criteria that you have set out. Again, this really depends on your use case. Or maybe you just want to update a record. So now, let's say I have record updated as my trigger, the last email interaction updated on the person, and now I want to update that same record. People, updated record, and then maybe I want to update something else. So maybe I want to update the email outreach attribute. Again, this also depends on the kinds of attributes that you already have set up, but as an example, there you go. And then what do I want the new value to be? That again really depends on the options that you have, but that's an example. Another common scenario would be you want to add this record to a list. So now that this happened on this record, you want to add them to a specific list. So now they meet the criteria to be in that list and you want to add them there. So you'd add record to list. You can delete a list entry. So maybe you're looking to see if this person exists on a specific list, then you want to delete that list entry. That's where the delete list entry block would make sense. So you would find list entries and then you would delete list entry. For example, if your trigger is list-based, then this probably makes sense, delete list entry, and then update list entry. So again, in this case, I have a record updated trigger. Now I want to see if that person record exists on my list, and then I want to update that list entry. And so that's really valuable if you have list-specific attributes. So we can have attributes on objects and we can have attributes on lists. And we can have attributes that just live on a list and not an object. So that's where that would make sense. Or enroll in a sequence or exit that person from a sequence, for example. So with sequences, you can enroll records manually into a sequence, or you can auto-enroll them in a sequence using this workflow. So if X happens, I want this record to be enrolled in a sequence. I want them to receive, XYZ emails from us. Agents, so this is a research record agent. So Attio's AI agents can do research on a specific record, but the research would be outside of Attio. And then there's these AI blocks as well. I have another video on this, so if you are curious about how these work, then I would check out that video. And then tasks, so maybe I want to now mark a task as complete or create a task. And then conditions. So this is where you can set out some criteria, right? So record was updated, or maybe I created a new record, but I only want this workflow to run if the record meets a certain criteria. So filter, new value. In this case, let's do, new value, width is Kayla. So this trigger doesn't make too much sense for this condition, but you could add in a condition here where the last email interaction was with this user and now I want this workflow to run. Or you can do record created, person, filter, created record, and then you can decide on the attribute. So I only want this workflow to run if, the owner of this record is, this person, for example. So next would be if else. So this is good for a workflow that requires two paths. So this makes sense if this is true, then we do this. If this is false, then we do this. Sometimes it could be if this is true, then continue the workflow. If it is not true, then let's just end the workflow. We don't need to continue. And then switch. So this one is really helpful for several different paths. So for example, if deal is X, assigned to this person. If deal is Y, assigned to this person. If deal is, Z, assigned to this person. So you can set up several different paths all within one workflow. And this means you're not having to create separate workflows for each scenario. You can pretty much create all of those different workflows in one. It's really just, if you have the same trigger, same thing happens, but you need to break it down into different paths. So this is good if it doesn't necessarily fit into a if true this, if false this. It's dependent on other criteria or other updates, and it requires several paths, not just one or two. Then this makes sense. And then delay. So the delay step just means we're pausing the workflow for a specific amount of time. So this is helpful if you need to, let's say you update your deal to X stage, and then you want to be reminded to follow up with that deal in, X number of days. Then you would do, deal has been updated. Deal was updated to X stage. Now delay for 2 days and create a task for me on that day, for example. So delay. You can input the amount of time. So seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks. So days, 2 days, and then create your task, for example. That's just a quick example of where you'd use delays. And then delay until is normally when you're delaying until something specific happens, or maybe you're delaying until a specific date. So this is good for workflows that are not necessarily ongoing workflows. Maybe you're enrolling everyone in a workflow today for something that's upcoming, and you want to delay your next step until Friday, January 9th, because you know that you'll have to follow up again on that date. Whereas delay is more of a variable, right? It's, delay for 2 days or X amount of time, and then continue the workflow. Broadcast message, this would just trigger a little notification here. So this is helpful if you want to remind people to fill in a field or an attribute, for example. So let's say I move a deal to the loss stage and I don't input a loss reason, and I have that as an attribute. I can have a broadcast message where it notifies the workspace that the reason was not filled out. And then celebration, so this would just be, it's just like a fun little way to celebrate, success. So a deal being won, for example, or you can have a round robin here as well. So a round robin is really helpful for those scenarios where you are lead or deal assigning to a number of salespeople, but it's not really based on a specific criteria. It's just, new deal comes in, assigned to this person. Next deal comes in, assigned to this person. So it's a round robin format. It's not based on territory. It's not based on anything. So you would input your sales team here. So the users, you would select them from here. You would input everyone on your sales team, for example, that you want to include in this round robin. And then the next step would be updating the record, for example, to be assigned to whoever is chosen. So this is the round robin, pick between one or more users, and then you would update your deal record, for example, to be, so record, let's say created record, attributes to update, deal owner, and then the deal owner would be the picked user from the round robin. And that's basically how you'd set that up. So I hope that was a helpful overview of Attio's workflows. I covered the triggers and some of the most common action blocks. I, of course, didn't really get into any of the more advanced blocks because if you are newer to Attio's workflows, I would suggest keeping it simple until you get really familiar with them. But if you learned something from this video, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you need one-on-one help with Attio workflows or Attio in general, then feel free to schedule an intro call with me. My link and contact info is in the description. Thanks for watching.